Welcome to Justice Matters. I'm Denise George, Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Justice Matters is a program aimed to inform, engage, and empower you with knowledge of Virgin Islands laws that affect our everyday lives and our entire community. We have insightful discussions with special guests on the laws and related topics so you can be empowered with knowledge about the issues and take action so you can make a difference in our community and be a part of the solution. Today's topic is right on point about that, being a part of the solution in our fight against crime. When I say our, I mean us, each and every member of our community. Crimes are solved through investigation, arrest, prosecution, and conviction. You probably have heard from time to time, if you see something, say something. You see, in order for a crime to be solved by law enforcement through investigation and arrest and followed up by a prosecution and conviction, U.S. Virgin Islands laws and the U.S. Constitution requires evidence. Evidence must be presented in order to establish probable cause to sustain an arrest. And after an arrest, prosecutors must show evidence beyond a reasonable doubt in order to convict someone of that crime. Much of the way law enforcement depends on getting that evidence is through information and tips from people like you and me, members of our community, to come forward with what they know and what they see. The slightest bit of information can lead law enforcement in the direction to investigate and get more evidence needed ultimately to solve those crimes that beset our community and help make our community safer for all of us. One can call a law enforcement agency directly. Call 911 or contact a known police officer or law enforcement official that you have confidence in. VIPD even has confidential tip lines in St. Thomas and St. Croix. And then there's a nonprofit, non-law enforcement organization made up of community volunteers called VI Crime Stoppers. Sounds very familiar, I'm sure. This international organization of private citizens in the Virgin Islands are engaged in the fight against crime and creates yet another opportunity for members of our community to come forward with crime tips and information safely and confidentially. Joining us today is Laurie Dunton of Crime Stoppers here in the Virgin Islands to give us more insight on what and how they facilitate the fight, or I should say the community's fight against crime in the Virgin Islands. Well, welcome to Justice Matters, Laurie. Can I call you Laurie?
Yes, you may. Yes.
Okay. Well, Laurie, I want to first let you explain exactly what is Crime Stoppers. What kind of entity is that?
That's a very good question because many people don't understand the workings surrounding the organization. Crime Stoppers is a 501c. It's a nonprofit organization. It's international. So we have over 100 chapters throughout the world, different countries, Colombia, Afghanistan, you name it. And then in the United States, every state has a Crime Stoppers chapter. Many states have multiple chapters. For instance, Florida has 3 or 4, Miami-Dade, Central Florida, Northern Florida. In the Virgin Islands, we have a chapter that covers St. Croix, St. Thomas, and Water Island. We also receive
Would that
tips,
be St. John as well?
And St. John,
Thomas,
yes,
St. John,
yes,
okay.
and Water Island. We also receive tips from BVI and Puerto Rico.
I see. Okay, well, you talk about the organization. What is it made up of? Is this nonprofit made up of private citizens?
Yes.
Or?
So in the Virgin Islands, we have a completely volunteer organization. Mm-hmm. We have volunteers on all 3 islands, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John. None of the volunteers are paid. They're community members, community activists, citizens that want to make a difference in the community. Many of them come from different backgrounds. So we have everything from teachers to retired members of our community that want to volunteer, to several of our youth that have also taken on a media aspect for Crime Stoppers.
So what's the driving mission of Crime Stoppers then? When you have all these volunteers, members of the community, just like each and every one of us private persons, what is the driving mission of Crime Stoppers then in the Virgin Islands? Let's focus on our chapter.
The goal in the Virgin Islands is to present the community with an opportunity or an avenue to provide information regarding crimes. And when I say crimes, I'm not talking about something that happened today or yesterday, but we have a cold case chapter. So we deal with cases from years back. The tip line itself is anonymous, completely anonymous. When it was established in 2009, it was unfamiliar to the community. It was unfamiliar to all aspects of our community and entities. The chapter works through a multitude of connections, telephone lines, internet connections. It has been tested by the Federal Bureau of Investigations, FBI. It is not trackable. You cannot trace a Crime Stoppers tip of any venue, whether it's telephone, whether it's mobile phone, whether it's computer.
Well, tell us then, how exactly does it work? So you have the volunteers.
Yes.
Someone has a tip.
Right.
What
So
happens?
they have a choice. They can do the 1-800-222 tips. That would take you directly to a call center. What the telephone aspect does, and it works the same with our internet aspect, it bounces from one cell tower to another, which prevents the call from being traced. So as far as the telephone line goes, maybe it connects to our Canadian chapter, and then it goes to Virginia, and from Virginia it goes to Texas. And from Texas, the call center would pick up the phone call. They would take the information that the tipster has to provide, and they prompt you with questions so that you're not just left there, what do I say and how do I say it?
How do they keep a record of the tipster when a person calls in with a tip? How does Crime Stoppers keep a record, since they can't use a name because they don't know who it is? So
there's no record. So what we have is when the call center takes the information, they will then forward that information to the Crime Stopper chapter in the Virgin Islands. But there's no number associated with the tipster. There's no name associated with the tipster. When we get the tip, it is scrubbed. And when I say it's scrubbed, for instance, somebody may call and say, my neighbor. So we would take out my neighbor because we don't want that information going to anybody, law enforcement or anybody. So we make sure that anything that is sent or forwarded to our local law enforcement, VIPD, to our federal partners, ATF, DEA, FBI, it is completely scrubbed of any trace of information that might lead.
Identify the person. So you're talking about identification.
Identify the person or the area that the person might be calling from. If they make a call using our website or our free mobile app, which you can download on any app store, on any mobile phone, the same thing happens. It's bounced, and then it's forwarded back to Crime Stoppers in the Virgin Islands.
And then if any identifying information would then be scrubbed.
Correct.
Okay, then what happens after that then? Crime Stoppers then has to release that information
Correct.
to the law enforcement.
Correct. So the tip depending upon what the tip is, whether it's a domestic violence tip or a possible homicide tip or an animal cruelty tip. If it involves drugs or guns, that tip typically goes to DEA or ATF, to the federal partner side. If it's a homicide tip, that would be a VIPD tip. If it's an animal cruelty, that would go to the animal cruelty investigators. So once the tip is received, we look at who's best to serve this tip. And then that tip is forwarded to the appropriate law enforcement agency.
Now, if it relates to a local crime, a local criminal offense, why is it that it cannot be sent to both the local and federal? Like, how do you make that determination when it is also it's both a local and federal?
Correct. There's a threshold for federal offenses. So if you were to submit a tip and it involved 10 marijuana plants, that would be a local.
Well, let's say if it involves 16 illegal firearms.
Right. So we look at the entity that's going to be able to best serve that case. And we try not to do blue on blue. So we try not to send a tip to our local law enforcement and send that same tip to our federal partners and then not have them not working together. So oftentimes we'll make contact and we'll say, is this a tip that is best served through your organization, or should we send it elsewhere?
Okay. So that's how you preserve the anonymity, so
Absolutely.
to speak. So the mission and the intent, as I'm going back again to that question, the mission and the intent then, the ultimate goal of what Crime Stoppers is trying to do is what?
It's to provide law enforcement with information, critical information that will help solve cases and prevent future cases with the help of the community without having to have somebody identify themselves or testify. You can submit a tip. You do not testify. If you choose throughout the process or at any time after submitting that tip to make contact directly with a law enforcement agency and you choose to testify, that's totally up on the tipster. But the tip itself is anonymous, and we do not ask tipsters to testify.
So, but you talk about you still have constant communication. So how do you maintain the communication with the initial tipster?
Tipsters are given a PIN number, so they're given an identification number, and they can go back into the system at any time, and they can check the status of the tip, whether it's gone from under investigation to information already known, or possibly it's led to an arrest. So they can add information to the tip at any time. Once you make that initial contact and you have that PIN number, then you should check that tip frequently for updated information. And if you have any additional information that you want to add to that tip, you can do so at any time.
Okay. Is there a way then for law enforcement to have additional questions for that particular tipster and to get that information, those questions to that tipster?
So if law enforcement does have additional information that they're asking for, they will reach out to Crime Stoppers. They will provide Crime Stoppers with those questions, and then Crime Stoppers will communicate with the tipster through the anonymous tip line. VIPD and federal partners do not have access to the tips to communicate. So all communication has to come through Crime Stoppers. So the tipster is always, the anonymity of the tipster is always protected by Crime Stoppers.
How has this worked? Has it worked? How successful has Crime Stoppers Virgin Islands been over the years? You said from 2009?
2009 is when it was conceptualized. We have never had the identity of a tipster revealed. Throughout Crime Stoppers, throughout the international organization, we have never had a tipster identified.
Now, has Crime Stoppers been successful to what extent has it been successful in assisting local law enforcement in solving crimes?
Very much so. To date this year, we've paid out about $36,000 in rewards to tipsters.
And what's the basis of getting the rewards?
First of all, we have a matrix that we use when we're calculating rewards. But any information that leads to an arrest of an individual for homicide, guns, drugs, or it leads to a seizure. In other words, we don't necessarily have to have an arrest, but if we seize a number of guns or if we seize a quantity of drugs, that seizure gets paid out. So the tipster that provided the tip that led to the seizure also gets paid without an arrest. So you don't necessarily have to have the arrest of an individual to receive a reward. And then once there's been a seizure, whether it's a federal or local, once there's been an arrest, whether it's federal or local, the law enforcement agency contacts Crime Stoppers, notifies us through a disposition of the arrest, exactly what the charges were that were laid, the value of any of the assets that were confiscated at the time, and all of that goes into our matrix to determine the amount of the reward.
Okay. So are you then basing the rewards? The rewards, of course, is an incentive, right? But are you looking at the rewards as a way to gauge the success of Crime Stoppers in the Virgin Islands?
We really don't use the rewards as a gauge. We look at the number of tips that are coming in and the quality of the tips. Been very successful. And I have to say that we have a number of tipsters that in the process of delivering their tip, whether it's mobile phone or computer or call center, they say, I am not interested in a tip reward. They do not want a reward. They're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. And we also, and we recognize that, but we are also very willing to pay rewards for tips. We have had successfully been part of large seizures, seizures of drugs in excess of $700,000. We've had numerous guns confiscated strictly on Crime Stopper tips. We've been very successful in solving rapes, domestic violence. Almost every tip that we've ever gotten with regards to a wanted fugitive has been utilized to come successful in leading law enforcement to that wanted fugitive.
And the reason why I did ask that about how successful it is based on not so much the rewards, but the amounts of responses is I wanted to see how much the community would respond to something like because there are many who want to say what happened or they want to say what they saw, but they are in fear of their own safety at the time. So I wanted to see if they've used that opportunity to be able to do it in that confidential manner.
And they have, and we're very, very happy with the results we've gotten. We've also branched out to our school community. So we have a really well received school community that students are utilizing Crime Stoppers to provide information for schools and activities that are occurring within the schools. And so we're not only seeing it with our, more advanced criminal activity, but we're also seeing it at the elementary school levels. So we're out there. It's working.
So it gives that opportunity if it's an organization of citizens like citizens,
yes,
and providing assistance. So you do have those persons in the community who may or may not want to take the opportunity to report directly to the police, which is always encouraged.
Correct.
But the importance of reporting is it's so important that even if you don't do that direct reporting, report it, get the tip in, and it's going to be a help in any way. Right?
And the community needs to realize that they may have seen something that they really don't think is valuable. Oh, I saw a blue car sitting on the corner of the street. Huh. Report that blue car sitting on the corner of the street. Let us know approximately what time that blue car was sitting there. Even though it's not directly related to a homicide or a criminal activity, a burglary or what have you, that blue car may be a part of the information that is going to lead law enforcement to solving that case. Cases are not going to be solved to the extent that we want them to be solved in the Virgin Islands unless we have the support of the community.
It's the only way.
It's the only way it's going to happen. We are going to continue to bury our youth, our fathers, our mothers, our daughters, our sisters, our brothers. It's going to continue. It's not going to stop until we get the community to talk. And that's what Crime Stoppers is offering. It's a tool.
And what's good is that that's one of the very effective tools and opportunities available for all of us.
Yes.
Each of us are members of this community to be able to utilize in reporting these crimes. My one question is, when you talk about if someone sees a blue car and you think it's insignificant or somewhat innocuous, how does Crime Stoppers, or to what extent, I would say, would Crime Stoppers, these group of community volunteers, be able to make that connection that it could be connected to some other call or some other tip or some other thing that's going on? How do you make that connection?
So Crime Stoppers doesn't necessarily make the connection because we don't do the investigating.
Right.
All we do is we take the information and we feed it and we make sure that the information is getting to the appropriate agency. And that way the tipster doesn't have to directly make contact with law enforcement or identify themselves. PD, BIPD, or the federal partners will then build a matrix utilizing the tips in the area, the location, the time, what have you, and they use that information.
Okay. But even then, you still would have to connect somehow that to know which agency to send it to.
Correct.
So,
and again, if we know that it's coming in because it was a homicide in the
area,
when you submit the tip, you choose homicide. Is it associated with a homicide? Is it associated with a domestic violence? Is it associated with arson? Whatever. You tell us what it's associated with, and then we are able to shift that tip in the direction that it needs to go to.
Okay. So then, to be clear also, you indicated that when a call is made, the persons who answer the call are outside of the Virgin Islands. Is that right?
They're Texas, Virginia, or Canada.
Okay. So they pick up the call, and then I guess an initial screening, and then it goes to Crime Stoppers in the Virgin Islands.
Correct.
So what do the Crime Stoppers volunteers, our community volunteers in the Virgin Islands, what do they do with the tip? I mean, I understand you talk about the screening and scrubbing. Is that the work of the local volunteers? Is what I'm talking about, or is it, to liaise with the VIPD or the federal authorities?
So once the tip comes to Crime Stoppers, and not all of the volunteers in Crime Stoppers have access to the tips.
Mm-hmm.
So the tips are obviously very sensitive. So we limit exposure to the tips from our volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
So the tips come into Crime Stoppers, and then we have liaisons. We have law enforcement liaisons, VIPD liaisons on our islands, St. Thomas, St. Croix, St. John, that tip goes to that particular liaison. That liaison within VIPD then decides who within VIPD the tip is best sent to. And the same thing happens with our federal partners. Crime Stoppers is here to serve the community. We're not here to serve VIPD. We're not here to serve our federal agencies. We are here to serve the community. This is a tool for our citizens to utilize. Yes, it benefits law enforcement, but we are not part of VIPD. We are not part of any federal law enforcement agency. We are a nonprofit organization that serves the community. And it's an opportunity for people that have exposure to criminal activity, whether past, future, or in progress, to share that information. Mothers, fathers, daughters, they can all, reach out and say, hey, this is happening. And they're the ones with the knowledge. And that's how we're going to prevent these young children and our
entire community. Our entire
from,
community.
From being victims of violence.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome.
And for what it is that you and the other volunteers in our community volunteers do. It's all about us.
And we need more. We need more volunteers. Mm-hmm. So we have a website, crimestoppersvi.org, and there's an application for volunteers. And anybody that wants to join our organization is more than welcome to fill out the form, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much for joining us on Justice Matters.
Thank you.
Keep in mind, there are several opportunities available for you to say something if you see or hear something. I encourage you to make a call to 911 or to the VIPD confidential tip lines, St. Croix at 340-778-4850 or St. Thomas 340-642-8449, and also Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477, 1-800-222-TIPS. Thank you so much for joining us again on this episode of Justice Matters.